My name is Felicia Marie Nall. I direct the University of Miami's Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas and serve as professor at our Miller School of Medicine. Today, I join you as co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People, the president of a Mexican non-governmental organization, Tómate el Pecho, dedicated to improving the health and rights of women in Latin America, and very much as a proud member of the Governing Council of NCD Child. Let me start by thanking specifically NCD Child and the Hospital for Sick Children of Toronto, and especially Dr. Zulfikar Bhuttar, Laura Lewis-Watts, and Nick Matheny for all of the work in organizing this. Violence against women and young people is persistent and it's pervasive. It was, it is, and it will be of pandemic proportions and has only increased with COVID. Few, if any, health condition or risk factor affects such large segments of the global population, and young people are especially at risk. More than a third of women and girls, over 1 billion people, experience intimate partner violence or non-partner physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. Almost a quarter of all adults worldwide report physical abuse as children, and the lifetime prevalence of childhood sexual abuse is unacceptably high for both sexes, 20% for girls and 1 in 10 for boys. The COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with the violence pandemic, is a syndemic. Levels of violence have been exacerbated due to increased unemployment, impoverishment of families, stay-at-home orders, and heightened anxiety. Data from hotlines around the world report increases in calls, and the scarcity of resources for survivors and their families is palpable, especially during lockdown. The cost of inaction is huge, and the opportunity to act is equally large. Youth voices are a vital input to end gender-based violence and child abuse, and to change the social norms that have sustained them for centuries. Yet, we rarely hear from young people, and their voices are far, far too often stifled. Today, through thoughtful discussion and in partnership with NCD Child, our commission will engage young people as active and positive change agents. And with that, I have the enormous honor and pleasure of introducing our moderator, my friend and colleague, with whom I serve on the Governing Council, Dr. Marie Housekeeping, as our moderator again for today. Marie is a Danish physician and the chair of NCD Child and of the WHO GCM NCD Lab on Youth and the Next Generation. She is also one of our most active commissioners in our Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People. Marie, I turn it over to you, and thank you for all you've done to make this and so much possible for children and youth.
Thank you so much, Felicia, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. And thanks for everyone for joining us on this incredibly important webinar, where we really hope to bring attention to the issues of gender-based violence and maltreatment of young people, and what young people can do to that, and why their voices are so important. Today's webinar is presented by NCD Child, a global multi-stakeholder coalition championing the rights and needs of children living with or at risk of NCDs or non-communicable diseases, with a partnership with the University of Miami and the Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People, where I have the pleasure of being one of the young commissioners. I'll be moderating today's panel session, and Dr. Nicholas Matheny will be moderating the audience Q&A session. And then we'll move to the slide. And as always, we thank the AstraZeneca Young Health Program for their ongoing support for NCD Child's activities. And we'll just have a quick run through the agenda. So first, as you've heard, we've had opening remarks from our co-chair of the Lancet Commission, Felicia Nall. And then we'll be going into the panelists' remarks, and further on have a Q&A section, and then the closing remarks. And we have the pleasure of having the other co-chair joining us for that. Next slide, please. And then just a few housekeeping issues before we move into the agenda of today. So for all of you, it is important to know that today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be able to share this link with you after the event is complete. And we welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. We also invite you to share comments and questions using the chat or the Q&A function for questions by the end. And before we begin, it's important for us to say that we're so grateful for our panelists and viewers for engaging on these important topics. However, this webinar may include discussions on sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, identity-based harassment, and discrimination. And we understand that these topics might be distressing to some, and we encourage that you care for your own safety and well-being. We've placed some US-based and global resources in the chat that may help you process these emotions. And if you need to step away or log off, please consider accessing these resources before you leave the session. Next slide. And now we have the great honor of receiving a message from Dr. Chelsea Clinton, just to kick off the discussion of today. And to those of you that don't know, Dr. Chelsea Clinton is the Vice Chair of the Clinton Foundation, the NCD Poverty Commissioner, a global health advocate, and she's also a commissioner on the Lancet Commission on gender-based violence and maltreatment of young people. Okay, we'll see if we can have it at some other later point in time, but I think we'll move to our distinguished panel, and we will start off with a great colleague and youth champion, who is Grace Gatera, and she is another commissioner on this Lancet Commission. She's a lived experience mental health advocate living in Kigali, Rwanda. And Grace also serves, as I said, as a commissioner on the Lancet Commission on gender-based violence and maltreatment of young people. She's a young leader for the Lancet Commission on global mental health and sustainable development. Grace is passionate about meaningful youth involvement, particularly for under-resourced and underrepresented populations in the world. Please, Grace, share with us your perspectives on lived experience, including mental health.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Like Marie said, I don't know, I said your name weirdly, Marie. Like Marie said, I am a commissioner. This gives my mother no end of joy, especially on Mother's Day, when she's like, she's a commissioner with Chelsea Clinton. So thank you so much for that. But first of all, I identify very much as a lived experience advocate, someone who advocates from my lived experience of my mental health challenges. It has been my absolute honor to join this esteemed group, the Lancet Commission, because for the first time since I started advocating, I felt like we as in the people with lived experience, were finally getting the attention that we had fought for, and the appropriate representation through me and through other members of the commission, because when selecting this commission, I know that the chairs did a wonderful job. And yeah, so it felt really invigorating, and I felt like I'd finally gotten to a space where I could be a part of change, where I could change things for young people who grew up like me. I grew up as a refugee in Uganda, and as a refugee, of course, my parents and I and my other family members fled there when I was, I think, 1 year and 7 months, and we were refugees from the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. This gave me a concoction of mental health challenges. But unfortunately, since we're living in abject poverty, we were not able to get the care that we needed, and we were exposed and vulnerable to more, to a lack of things, a lack of resources, a lack of care, and therefore a lack of violence, while my parents are loving people, everywhere that I went, I experienced some sort of violence, be it emotional, be it psychological, be it physical. I remember the first violence I could say that occurred to me was when I would experience panic. And at school, the schools I would go to, I would get beaten and told that I'm pretending to be sick or that I'm pretending not to go through what I'm going through. And this made me very strange, and this made me very confused, because I was like, if they are right, because I'm a child, I don't know a lot. If they are right, then why does it hurt so much to pretend? Why can't I control it? And so as I grew up and I sought care, as I grew up in this space, and of course, other violences were meted out to me. I'm not ashamed to say that I was sexually abused by someone who was supposed to be my protector. And so growing in that kind of space, you lose hope very fast, and you lose the ability to believe in better. But when I moved back to my country, Rwanda, I decided to be autonomous and seek care for myself. And that's when things changed. Um, and that's when I started advocating, because there are so many other young children like me out there. There's so many other people in the country that I grew up in, Uganda. The problems that compound this cannot be limited to just, this is not, this is not the kind of care that refugees receive or people with poverty. There are a lot of problems surrounding that: the lack of resources, the lack of care, the lack of you know, governmental support, the lack of NGO support, the lack of multinational support. All of these things work together to create an environment that is unsafe for young children. Recently, these reports that come out, then even violence on online, and this just continue to grow because of COVID. We're all online, and there's not been enough cybersecurity invented, I think, to protect people against these kinds of violences online. So you find that the environment that we're in has become a bit of a crisis. And so why am I saying this, and why am I painting a doomsday picture? I think it's important. Felicia and the other members of this commission have started in the right direction by including people with lived experience, to not be just tokenistic supporters or people who contribute, but be commissioners, but sit in there, but talk about these issues and try to make change from within going out. And this is what we need at all levels of policy making, at all levels of lawmaking. And how can that be done? By listening to people like us, by listening to people in the Lancet Commission. Brilliant minds have come together to look at these issues and formulate issues, but that will not be helpful if people decide not to adopt the recommendations that we give them. And so I think that while there is giving, we are giving of ourselves, there has to be taking. And I think that's the only way we can protect young people like me. That's the only way we can protect the crisis that is about to come. It's already been a crisis, but the COVID has compounded it. And so we have to include people with lived experience. We have to listen to the experts, and we have to start working now. Thank you, Maria. I don't want to go too long because I'm very passionate about this. So I'll just let you pass this to the next panelist, but thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Grace. Every time I hear you speak, you're such a, it really touches my heart. And I really think the world is incredibly, we're so lucky to have you, and that you have the courage to speak up and share your stories. And by continuing to do so, even though I know it's not always easy, and I know it's challenging, and these things are really difficult to talk about, you are changing the world. And I think I can speak on behalf of many of us that we think it's important. We're committed to continuing giving young people like yourself the word to speak up when we have the chance, because this is really what we need. And I've heard you speak so many times, but every time it's just, yeah, it's so real. So thank you so much. So Sarah is a researcher and psychologist from the University of Southern Denmark. She has just submitted her PhD titled Psychological Trauma and Intimate Partner Violence, which focuses on psychological violence and an evaluation of women's shelter interventions in Denmark. Her main areas of interest involve family and partner-related violence from the perspective of mental health, including post-traumatic stress disorder. She's a co-chairwoman of the Danish National Center of Psychotraumatology, and she has previous experience with trauma research from a global health perspective, including former abducted child soldiers in northern Uganda. And Sarah has promised to share her perspectives on research and evidence, being a younger research herself, including participatory research. So please, Sarah, take the floor.
Thank you, Marie, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak here today. And also, thank you, Grace, for sharing your story. It was very touching to hear. So I've been asked to speak a bit about participatory research from my perspective as a researcher and as a psychologist. And I want to start by saying that for me, participatory research is, you can understand it quite broadly. First of all, it of course includes, the main subject of those that we want to do research with. For me, that's very often women who have been exposed to violence. But I also think it can include those who work very closely with the target group, like volunteers or professionals who are so deeply engaged in the work in different organizations within our field. So I've been reflecting on this issue of participatory research and why we should include participants. And I think perhaps one of the biggest limitations to research is that we only get answers to the questions that we ask. Meaning that if we don't know to ask, or if we don't think to ask, we're not going to get any new knowledge on any specific topic. But by bringing in participants and working very closely, we can get new perspectives and raise new questions and learn a lot more. Further to this, I think it brings us and different worlds closer together, because when we're working, for me, I normally work in the university, and that can feel quite distant to the people who have lived the experience and those who engage on a daily basis working with victims of abuse. So for me, engaging with these with victims and organizations, brings new perspectives and it brings us closer together, but it also helps break down some of the barriers that can be for researchers, because quite often there can be many concerns evolving research. A lot of people, in my experience, I often feel that there can be concerns regarding the researcher's intentions and how we will obtain and handle the information given and why we're doing it. And it can be quite time consuming. So involving people in the process, I believe, makes people feel more safe, and it makes the projects a lot more meaningful, because I get new perspectives into how I should, go about studying a specific topic. Finally, research has shown that actually it has limited negative consequences to involve participants in research, because a lot of people, and it can even be beneficial because it makes people feel heard and seen. And we kind of relate this to some of the things we find in treatment, where most research has shown that when people are engaged in their own process, when they have a voice, when they're being heard, they have better outcomes for therapy and other interventions. And I think these 3 points are even more equally important when we try to relate them to the current situation and some of the problems that we are currently facing. in the last year, we've seen increasing rates of IPV and child maltreatment reports throughout the world. And some researchers, as we heard initially, has even called it a pandemic within the pandemic. And now it falls back on us as researchers to try to explain, why are we seeing these increasing numbers? Is it actually so that abuse has increased during this lockdown because of frustration, job loss, mental health problems connected to the COVID-19? Or is this perhaps some of the shadow numbers that we have been discussing for years, because people are now forced to spend more time with the perpetrator in their homes during lockdown, which has just made it unbearable for people to stay in that situation. So more people are now reporting and seeking help from some of the domestic violence shelters and so on. Another contemporary challenge, which is similar to what Grace mentioned, is technology, because we've seen a technological development in recent decades that has just developed so fast, and it has dramatically changed the way that we socialize, communicate, and even the way that we date. And new types of abuse are approaching from this development regarding cyber violence, and our children and youth are particularly vulnerable. And I think this forces us to rethink how we understand abuse, and also how do we prevent it and how do we intervene. And I was asked to speak here today as a young researcher to give a younger perspective, but truth be told, the secret world of social media among adolescents and teenagers is, even unknown to me. So for me to understand and study these new phenomena, I need the voices of young people who have lived this experience and who engage on these platforms. And I need to learn how to understand, to use them, to communicate through them, to reach the young generation, to understand, or to help them understand that there are ways that they can, seek out and get support. So I hope it's clear from my short presentation here that I'm a big advocate for participatory research. But at the same time, I think it's very important that research remains independent and curious and objective. So I don't know if this will be on the agenda for something we can discuss today, but maybe just as a reflection for a take-home message, I want to end my presentation by raising a question, because how do we incorporate more participatory research in close collaboration with volunteers and professionals who are engaging in this issue, while also ensuring that research still remains, independent and from any personal or political agendas? Because I think sometimes when you get involved as a researcher, that can also be quite challenging to still keep that professional distance. So yeah, just a short introduction to some of my reflections. And again, thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really think those were very interesting insights from you, and clearly as a young researcher. And it is great to understand how we can engage survivors or participants in the research, and what you believe that can bring. For NCD Child, we always believe in bringing in young people to everything we do, and for me that is then inherent to think, and also listening to Grace, that bringing in the people affected into the research design seems like a very, very interesting way to work, and like that could bring, as you say, new perspectives and maybe questions and challenges to the table that the researchers have not already considered. And also thanks for bringing up again the shadow pandemic, the violence that has really increased, or the numbers that have increased during COVID. So that was really insightful. Now I'll hand over to our third speaker, which is Mabhena Luna. Mphokuhle has been with Sonke Gender Justice since 2010, where she began her journey as an intern. Over the years at Sonke, she has worked on several projects that include working with refugees and migrants and assisting them to access healthcare services, as well as equipping them with knowledge on their human rights while they reside in South Africa. Mphokuhle is currently coordinating work on children's rights and positive parenting on a project that focuses on Uganda and Tanzania. She's also the Men Care Global Coordinator, a global fatherhood campaign active in more than 50 countries on 5 continents. Mphokuhle will share perspectives on community engagement and youth-led interventions with us here today. Please, Mphokuhle.
Thank you so much. And hello, everyone. I hope all of you are okay. So thank you for the organizers for inviting me to speak on this important subject on the perspective, on gender-based violence and maltreatment of young people, with a special focus on the humanitarian and conflict perspective. So before I get a bit deeper into my presentation, I'd like to share a bit about Sonke Gender Justice. So it's an NGO that was established in the year 2006 as a human rights-based organization. So the vision that we have is to have a world in which women, children, youth, men, and gender non-conforming individuals can enjoy caring, healthy, happy relationships, that contribute to a gender just and democratic society which is free from poverty. So Sonke has various programs that focus on a wide range of issues that affect our societies. And one of the programs that I will largely speak about in my presentation is the Regional Programs Unit, which works across Africa and the world at large through various partnerships that we have with like-minded organizations. So for example, like in the introduction, we have the Men Care Global Campaign, which is a fatherhood campaign, which is active in more than 50 countries on 5 continents, where we are the co-coordinator at Sonke, as well as Promundo. We also have the Concern Worldwide project that is also a global project which works in areas that are mostly conflict zones where we also find young people. So I'll also try in my presentation to touch on some of the examples from these wonderful partnerships that we have with our partners. And we, as Sonke, are also the Secretariat of Men Engage Africa. Men Engage Africa is a regional network of the Men Engage Global Alliance, and it's made up of 22 African country networks across East, South, and West and Central Africa. So the reason why I'm mentioning this background is just to give a global picture on the countries that we work with, where you find that in some countries where we work in, they are still in conflict and some are post-conflict. Well, some are not in conflict, which is quite exciting. But from the list of countries, like I mentioned, we do see that there's quite a number of countries in Africa. I won't be able to mention all of them that we work in the 22 countries, which is the DRC, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and so on. So within the Men Engage structure itself, we also have the Men Engage Youth structure, which recognizes that globally there has been a gap in youth involvement. So I'm quite excited that we were given this opportunity to come and speak, as the youth about these issues that really affect us. So I am then next slide. The situation on the ground. No, sorry, not the next slide, the previous slide. I'm going to speak about the situation on the ground. So I'm sure you heard Grace's story about, what young people often face, especially during conflict times. So you find that violence in general and maltreatment is the top issue that affects young people. And Africa is not spared at all. And in fact, in Africa, we see a lot of violence, especially in war-torn countries, in the form also of sexual and gender-based violence. And I'm sure you'll agree with me me that young women tend to suffer most when it comes to, being in a conflict environment, as women's bodies are usually used as a weapon of war. So I'll give an example. In 2014, we did a study in partnership with Tier Fund, where we found that young girls that we interviewed in our focus group discussions had been impregnated by rebels or men from the armed forces. We saw a sad future and generation, really, because these young women were going to raise fatherless children who were born out of rape. It's painful enough that you are living in an unsafe space that is marred with war. And the worst to happen to you is for you to get raped, and even more to bear a child with the face of your rapist. So in most of our interactions with the women and girls, we found that there was that disconnect between mother and child. And I could only imagine the burden that at such a young age, as a young woman, having to carry on living with a child that you don't really love or wanted in the first place. So these are similar stories that we get to hear really around rape and sexual violence, and women suffer the most. I mean, Grace's story really, took me back to the time when we were in the DRC, where, we heard such stories of beautiful young women that, were so painful to even think about. That so what is our future really as young people in Africa, especially in war-torn countries? So now, if you look at young men, on the other hand, because of the societal expectations that as a man, you need to be tough, you need to be firm, you need to be strong, and you need to be violent, we often see young men in conflict settings, joining the armed forces or the rebels. I think a few days ago, there is a minister in the DRC who was calling out on young men to leave the armed forces, and try and be peacemakers in the country. For me, it really stood out that even in this day and age, as we are sitting here gathered right now, young men are being recruited into using arms, and in so using the arms, we also see them inserting this violence towards young women, which is something that is really painful, because I try to imagine the future that we have, especially for young people who are living in these war-torn countries. And another perspective, if I can share, of the maltreatment of young women is that of poverty and unemployment. So in cases where conflict is still active, you find that, mechanisms like having to go to school, they're next to non-existent. And generally, there is no time or focus for, a young person to seek education, because you have to make ends meet, you have to run away, you have to seek refuge, you have to make sure that you're safe. So when you look at today's world, I mean, without education, it's a bit difficult for you to make it out there. So in the event that there is a school in a war-torn zone, we've also seen cases where girls are being abducted or raped or forced into child marriages. And a classic example is that of the Chibok girls in Nigeria, which brought about the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls movement. So you find that as a young person, especially as a girl, it's usually, the bodies are used as a mass weapon during these difficult times. And the trauma that goes on with such an experience of having, to be abducted and separated from your parents or your loved ones is something that is so painful. And I'll touch a bit on child marriages. Because of time, I won't be able to really dig deep into my presentation. It's another form of violence, I think, that we've seen in our programs, that young girls are oftenly married off, because of poverty, because there's this powerful men in community. Then they have to be, given off. And another form also, the practice of female genital mutilation. So, I mean, one may argue that we do have policies in Africa that, denounce or prohibit or criminalize these acts, But in the instance of a conflict zone, such policies are close to non-existent because there are other priorities that seem to be, in the agenda. So these cases often go, unreported because, there's no accountability mechanisms that could force the government to enforce this as a priority. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly touch on the lessons learned or interventions or support. So it's through identifying these forms of violence towards young people that, the Men Engage Youth members work collectively towards advancing some of these things that I've been speaking about. So for example, they focus on gender justice, human rights, and social justice in key thematic areas involving issues around SRHR, gender-based violence, and HIV prevention. So because of time, I'll briefly share some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. So for one, we felt that, creating a youth-led support structure is quite key and essential. So examples like the Men Engage Youth structure, which is a voice led by the young people, the agenda is issues that are, made by the young people. In South Africa, we also have the South Africa Council of Churches Youth Forum, which is a faith-led intervention, but it's led by the youth. And so in having these structures, we are guaranteed as young people that, our agenda does make it into these spaces. And also for me, I guess having such platforms as this talk today, it makes us really have that voice and become visible that we are young people and these are the issues that, really affect us. Another thing that we have learned along the way is the power of religion and culture. I mean, these play a huge role in shaping us as society. An example again that I'll use is that when we did the study with Tier Fund in the eastern part of the DRC, we found that the church really can be a safe haven, because most people, in fact, I can say all the countries do relate to some form of religion, be it Muslim, be it Christian or Buddhism. So you do find that a church is usually found as a safe space. And another thing really that we found is that, there are policies that are developed for young people. And I think what's lacking is the one implementation, two accountability mechanisms. But it's really nice. We as Sonke have also developed some policies for young people. And we do hope that, our governments and leaders do take these policies into action. And another thing, we still need more research in these areas so that, these policies can be better beefed up with evidence to say this is what's happening in Rwanda. This is what is happening right now in Mozambique where young people are beheaded. So what do we need to do? How can we hold the government accountable so that we make safe spaces for young people? Another example, well, I won't speak much about it, is the One Man Can campaign manual that we developed together with a partner organization in Sudan on peace building and gender equality. It was something that was really powerful and really helped to shape, the peace building in the country. I really wanted to share a case study briefly about a project also that we do at Sonke Gender Justice, which is the refugee health and rights. I know I've spoken about, refugees in country, let's say in Rwanda or the DRC, but I also wanted to share a bit of a case study for refugees and migrants who migrate to South Africa. So you find that a young person may have run away from all these atrocities that I've spoken about earlier on, and they find themselves settling here in South Africa. So one thing to note is that South Africa does not have refugee camps. So if a young person comes to South Africa, they need to integrate with the community. They need to look for a job or they need to look for a school. So issues around language. How do you communicate if you're coming from a French country, for example? So how do you even start to integrate with a community that you're not even familiar with? So there's quite a lot of issues that young people tend to go through. And if I may take the same example and throw it into a country where there are refugee camps, that young person still finds themselves quite limited because they are confined to the refugee space. Next and last slide, please. I know I've taken a bit of time. So the way forward. So for me, I think, taking the baton from what has been done before, I use the June 16 example, which is where youth here in South Africa, went to the streets. They demanded that they needed, education. Something which we also see in the present day in South Africa, where there's the hashtag fees must fall. So these are young people who are still echoing the youth of 1956, where they are still passionate about, wanting social change when it comes to their access of, of free education, which is something that I think we as the social media, I mean, there's quite a number of movements that we have seen young people putting on the social media so that it becomes an agenda. And also the voices of young people affected by conflicts in natural hazards and conflict itself, they are quite important. And I'm glad that in this space we did get Grace to come and share with us her experiences on what she has gone through. That in itself just makes this whole talk more concrete, because we are hearing it firsthand from a person who's lived that experience, and not for me, who's someone who's coming from outside and has done some work around that. And then lastly, how do we make spaces like the church as safe spaces for young people? How do we identify certain spaces where we feel that these can be safe spaces? Sorry, I get so passionate when I talk about these issues, because as a young person I'm affected, and I honestly owe it to the work that I do. And I believe that I continue doing this work that I do, not only for our generation as the youth, but for the future generation. So I think I'll leave it there. I think I've taken so much time, but thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mphokuhle, and thank you for sharing your insights from the region in such a comprehensive manner. I really think we got an incredible opportunity there to learn from you, knowing that 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted as a child. We just see through your stories how that is exacerbated by conflict, and these numbers and stories that you share from the conflict areas, they are really motivating and a drive for change. And thanks also, and like we congratulate you for engaging young people. Again, I really think that is one of the ways forward to change the narrative here and to do something for our own generation and generations to come. Now we'll move on to our last speaker today in the panel, that is Amir Bhatia. Dr. Amir Bhatia is a social epidemiologist and mixed methods researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Amir's research examines social inequalities in child health and child protection outcomes, biases in data for child health, and the role of global and local organizations in producing and using data in South Asia. Amir has over a decade of professional and research experience working on child health and protection issues, and completed her MPH and SCD at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Amir, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Marie. Well, I'm not certain it's possible to follow such thoughtfulness, such passion, and such brilliance, and I feel really honored to be included among this list of participants. So I'll speak for about 7 minutes. And what I really want to do is to pull together some of these incredible threads that we've already heard in the context of COVID-19, and think about or offer a few different lessons that myself and other colleagues have been thinking through in terms of how we move forward, and what we can learn from the horrendous grief and suffering that this pandemic has brought to many of our homes and many of our lives. So our work really started at the beginning of the pandemic, where children were being presented often as silent carriers and silent spreaders with low risk. And I don't need to tell all of you how demeaning, how degrading, and how erasing this language is of the agency, of the passion, of the activism, and of the many contributions that children and young people have offered our societies and our communities. So at the London School, and I'm a researcher, so that's kind of the lens through which I'll be speaking today. Many of us were infuriated and very irritated about this language. And we started to think through, actually, how can we start a conversation about the many ways in which COVID is affecting children, specifically in the context of violence. And so I just want to flag the work of some incredible colleagues who spent this last year creating a living document of all of the studies on violence against women and children and COVID. Because at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of vagaries about what was happening to violence. And 100 studies on, over a year later, and I can put this in the chat box, what we definitively know, where overwhelmingly the evidence is suggesting that COVID-19 response measures have affected the prevalence and incidence of violence. Many studies are documenting increases. They've also changed the severity, the types, and the risks of violence. My co-panelists have flagged online violence and cyber violence. Other studies point to increases in police violence against young people because of the power that police have been given, more than usual, to enforce lockdown orders, for example. Importantly, we can also document that COVID-19 response measures have changed the functioning of response and support services, and whether it's even possible to report and help seek after violence. And let me just flag that this is very unequal. So some helplines where children and bystanders can report violence have reported increases, others have reported decreases in calls, some have said the number of silent calls have increased, and others have said that young people in poorer communities and girls are now less likely to call. So nothing here is on average or aggregated. There are deep and pervasive inequalities in all of the points that I'm making today. And also, none of this is new, right? And my co-panelists have highlighted that we started off with a very high pre-COVID prevalence of violence, with high inequalities both within and between countries. I'm from India and from Nepal, and we're at the start of the pandemic in many senses, in a way that many high-income countries in Europe and America are not any longer. We also started with a pre-COVID context of weak violence prevention and response systems. And when you stress already weak systems, they're much more likely to break. And limited financing for violence, right? If we think about financing for nutrition or other child health outcomes, violence has been systematically underfunded. And there's many global agencies calling for this to be urgently changed. And I think this is really important, unequal access to technology and the internet, because many of the solutions that are emerging right now are digital. But I think it's important to pause and to say which young people can access these new digital innovations and which ones will not be able to. So I think this is important to flag both as a motivation, but also to set the stage for kind of the next bit of my presentation. And kind of the big point I want to make here is anything you might hear about a decrease in reporting, less child protection services cases, fewer phone calls, it does not mean violence has become less visible. It doesn't mean that violence has become less prevalent, just that it has become less visible. And I want to draw attention to this language of silence, of invisibility, and underscore that it's our job as researchers, as activists, as policymakers, as funders, to really think about where we're placing our power, our money, and our attention, and what we are choosing to make visible in this moment. So with that, let's just turn to some work in progress that I've been working on with colleagues at the London School, in South Africa, and Nepal, at Harvard, and at UNICEF's Office of Research in Italy. So we are starting to think through some lessons, and this is not exhaustive, but I just wanted to share some that came out of these conversations in this work. First, it's high time that violence services are deemed essential, pandemic or not. And importantly, many countries did not make this decision in the context of COVID. So I think that's a key lesson. Another one, which we've touched on already, is everything we've learned about remote service delivery. And there are a lot of important, innovative learnings. How to improve and strengthen helplines. Is it possible to report violence over the phone? Can we use apps to talk to young people? These need to be integrated, but they should not replace in-person service delivery, because we know that scale up and access to these digital technologies will be unequal, given the pre-existing inequalities in access to the internet and access to cell phones. But they do represent some really important areas for further exploration around violence prevention and response interventions. Thirdly, again, this is not a new point. COVID has magnified it. It's time to really recognize and support the labor of child protection staff. And let's say that the gendered labor more specifically, because we know overwhelmingly health workers and teachers in low and middle income countries are women, work for less pay than men and have worked through this pandemic with minimal access to health insurance, to paid sick leave, and to other protections and in their workplaces. So this is really important, and this includes teachers, social workers, counselors, and child protection officers. Fourth, a multi-sectoral commitment to violence prevention. And what this basically means that, and my co-panelists have said this already, violence prevention is not just the job of one agency or one NGO. It's time to think really carefully about what justice systems are doing, what health organizations are doing, what are the links between mental health and violence, between access to the justice system and violence. And it's important that we reframe violence not just as interpersonal, meaning what happens between me and another person and what might happen to my body, but as systemic, as structural, and as patterned at the household, at the school, at the community, and at the policy level. All of this to say is that if you are working at any of these levels, it's time to carefully and thoughtfully think about violence prevention and response, which is also to say that none of us are off the hook. Sometimes I hear things like, oh, my interventions are in the household and violence intervention should be at the school, or they're somebody else's responsibility. That's not true at all. And increasingly, there's incredible evidence pointing to what you can do at the school level, within homes, in the context of parenting programs to prevent and respond to violence. All right, stay with me, just a couple more. Another piece of emerging evidence from the pandemic is the importance of family-friendly, child-sensitive policies and programs that explicitly address social inequalities, that invest in communities, schools, children, and families. And you'll notice that the word violence is not in this point, and that's deliberate, because many successful efforts to prevent and respond to violence come from different sectors, come from social protection programs, come from efforts to address food insecurity, to improve sick leave, maternity leave, policies to support women at home and in the workplace. And all of this is central, not peripheral, to efforts to prevent violence against children and women. We've heard a lot about this, and I defer to my co-panelists on this, of course, but we need to reinvigorate the call for youth leadership and involvement that is not tokenistic and that is inclusive. Often as a researcher, something I hear is, oh, we asked some children. Well, which children did you ask? Did you think about gender? Did you think about disability? Did you think about age? Did you think about children who were in school or out of school? And how did you involve them? Did you involve them as participants or as partners? And I think the last thing I want to say here about tokenism is sometimes there's a dangerous line where, as adults, we say, young people can do it. They are the future. And of course they are, but that doesn't give us permission to opt out. And so I think there is a lot of humility, a lot of learning that we need to do as researchers to be good allies and to share this work and not to expect young people to do it by themselves, but to create enabling environments where they can carry it forward, to think about inclusion, and again, to use whatever money, power, and resources we have at our disposal to make sure these conversations do not sit at the periphery, but come into the center of the design of violence programs and of violence research. And related to that, partnerships and funding for Indigenous leaders, for women's groups, and for community organizations, and for institutions who are upholding alternatives to child protection systems that are often neo-colonial and that haven't been decolonized. And so I think there's really an important invitation here to think carefully and critically about who we include in our research, who we're funding, and which voices we privilege. And we're in global health, how we direct resources to those voices. So I will leave it there. Those are some of the lessons, some of the motivations for our work. And I want to share this resource with you because I saw a few questions in the chat. This is about how you can engage children as partners. It's created by a bunch of wonderful colleagues at the Child Protection Learning Network, and I will also put it in the chat box with you. And it links to a Dropbox with, I think, over 100 different resources on how to do child participation and partnerships with children in research meaningfully, so we can all start this process of unlearning and relearning. Thanks so much, and I pass back to you, Marie.
Thank you so much, Amia, for your very interesting intervention. And I really believe, as the previous speakers, you have really underlined how COVID has been a magnifier of some of the existing problems and inequalities that we saw in this world before the pandemic. And thank you also for putting a gender lens on the workforce for the people who are part of the support system and part of the solution, or creating a positive environment and the right systems and healthcare for people that experience violence. And then as well, I think I really appreciate that you also spoke to youth participation and some of the challenges that we see with that. There is definitely no easy way to do youth participation in a meaningful way, but yeah, we're thankful to people like Felicia Knoll and Flavia Pusteo, who are the co-chairs of the Lancet Commission, to give us opportunities and to really champion and enable real meaningful youth participation. So we'll move on to the Q&A section now. And I see some questions have already come in. So thank you so much for that. We'll just take one question first, and that will be for any of the panelists who would like to answer this. What are the major forms of gender-based violence that you have encountered in your work or personally? Would any of the panelists like to speak? You can just speak up if you have something to say.
I guess I can start.
Yes, start.
Well, I think for me, most often I hear of psychological violence or some types of psychological abuse. You look a bit confused, Maria.
No.
Was that not what you thought of? Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so psychological violence is because it's also very often interlinked with other types of abuse. And what I most often hear from the women I work with is that it's very difficult to express this type of abuse, even though you lived it. It's very difficult to get people to take your experience seriously and to get people to understand the impact of this type of abuse, even when it's present through also physical and sexual violence. So I think that's a real challenge, is to inform more about this type of abuse, how it's expressed, and the severe impact that this type of abuse can also have on its victims. So yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Great. And so, Amia, do you want to give your thoughts?
I can come in quickly just to say that I think as violence researchers, many of us have also experienced violence in our own lives. And so I think there's lots of really important questions there about how you do research on violence while also being a survivor, and how you amplify, support, and work with others to do this work. So I think in my journey, there's been a lot of really important learnings, and I've been grateful for the social justice organizations, often led by women, that work on violence, that have given me the courage to do the work that I do. And the second point that I want to make, Marie, is I spend a lot of my time in data and big quantitative data sets. And if others listening are like me, I think the thing I always come back to is the rows in a data set are real people in real places who had the courage to tell an interviewer about their experiences of violence. And that is unimaginably hard. And so I think as researchers, there's also a lot of humility and respect that I always carry for the participants in my data. I'll never meet them, I'll never know who they are, but I hold and honor their stories. Thanks.
Thank you, Lamia. I think that's really, really inspiring to hear. Without further ado, I think we'll actually move on to the Q&A section from the participants. And this will be Nicholas, or Dr. Nicholas Bethany, who will be moderating this session. And he's a global health nurse scientist whose research focuses on structural determinants of intimate partner violence and its negative health implications, for example, HIV. And multiply marginalized populations, especially women in low and middle income countries and LGBTI populations. Nick?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I have some great questions here in the Q&A. And so I am going to field those to particular panelists and sometimes to all the panelists. And so feel free to please pipe in with your own thoughts, and we'll go ahead and start. I believe this one is for Sarah and Amia. And I can see you're already typing this one, Amia, but for everyone's benefit, someone asked if either of the researchers have experience with human-centered design approaches as part of participatory research methods. And if yes, how can you speak on it, and how did you include it, and how might we improve upon those methods? I think Sarah maybe can go first, and then Amia can follow up.
Sure. Yeah, so I would say, unfortunately, I don't have any experience with like a full human design participant study, primarily due to lack of resources when we do these types of studies. But I do have experience with using it in part of a project. And I could give a recent example in which we're doing a EU-funded project in Denmark and Spain, in which we're screening all pregnant women for IPV and offering video counseling. And as part of that project, we've developed a safety app for the women who screen positive for IPV that they can use. So developing this app, we use participants on different levels. First, interviews, trying to get an understanding of what might be useful for them, what needs that they could identify. And then we had focus group interviews with different experts and organizations working with IPV exposed women, and to kind of comment and make suggestions for alterations. And then at the end, we again invited IPV exposed women to kind of comment on the final project and suggest changes. And it was just so clear and evident from that process that they had so many perspectives that we didn't think of, and quite a lot of changes. Luckily, there's many things that we agreed upon, but we made a lot of changes based on the specific experiences that these women could express and how they've lived the experience up until the day that they actually broke off the violent relationship or became free of the violence. So, but it was, it was a great learning opportunity for everyone involved. And I think the product became really good. but it was also quite, challenging and time consuming. And unfortunately, there's also been projects where it's just been really hard to incorporate. So yeah, I guess that's, just a recent experience I've had with it, but I think it's definitely something I want to work on a lot more in my future career because of what I gained from that experience.
Great, thank you so much. Mia, anything to add to Sarah's comments?
Just that I can put 2 resources in the chat, but thank you for this question, and thanks, Nicholas.
Yeah, of course. No. The next question, there's so many good questions. The next question is from someone who's wondering for Mpho and for Grace, but for all the panelists as well, given the sensitive nature and tremendous courage shown by young victims of violence, what are the best practices for finding these voices in order to bring them to the fore, both in research and advocacy, and how to improve the conditions that they face? Maybe Grace, you will have some comments first, and then Mpho can follow up.
Yeah, sorry guys. I'm gonna keep my camera off because my internet is so bad. But yeah, sensitive is always a big deal. But I would say that, and again, best practices differ depending on the level of participation that you want these voices to be engaged. But I'd think that should you include them as equal members of the research work, as co-researchers or co-producers, it's not as sensitive as when they're like, the subjects or the people who are answering surveys and stuff like that. When you include them, then it's actually much easier. And that's what I advocate for. And so, yeah, so one, include them in the whole thing from conception. When you're thinking about it, to finding space in your research to employ them as actual co-researchers or co-advisors or something, to disseminators, to feedback givers, things like that. And while doing that, please remember to pay them. I know that doesn't answer the question, and I think I'll leave that to Mpho, but yeah, that's my answer.
Great, thanks, Grace. Mpho, anything to add there?
Thank you, Grace. You've touched some points that I had jotted down, but maybe to add on is, my internet is not so stable. Can I just switch off my video?
Sure.
Maybe to add is, one thing that I think is missing, or that we don't usually do, is seeking consent from, young people. I always think that getting their consent, because I know there are some young people who would love to tell their stories, who would love to share some of the things that they go through, but I don't know whether we don't seem to do it right. But for me, getting consent from young people, and also, working with youth-led organizations, because that's where we also find such information. You also look at children's, organizations like Save the Children. They usually have so much data around that. Also think of schools, institutions like schools and universities. There is a lot of, young people who are housed there. I also think of churches. I mean, you approach, faith leaders to seek, whether there is anyone who may be interested to share. So in a nutshell, I feel like, getting consent from young people are always willing to share their lived experiences. It's just, giving them the space to say, here is the space. And once you get the consent from them, then we're good to go. That's my 2 cents.
I think that's so. I think Dr. Nall also had some interesting points to bring in here.
Just very quickly to say that numbers like 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 mean that all of us on the screen are likely to have lived it ourselves or through those that we love very deeply. And not all children can raise their voices and not all children are willing to do so. So I think it's upon us to figure out the safe spaces through which we can project their needs and their stories. And to recall, I think one thing that Grace also mentioned is that when we do enable them to speak publicly or facilitate, it is on us to make sure that they're safe in all ways during and after they speak out, which is part of what we believe in as a commission.
Absolutely, thank you. We have time for a couple more questions, and I think I want to highlight some questions that weave together this idea of stopping a cycle of violence as it begins in childhood. Francisca from Chile has asked, said that many of the young people who have been victimized are then involved in violent acts. And they must bear the sanctions imposed by the system for those acts that then generates more violence. So what, panelists, do you think are some good strategies that either you know of in your countries or in others to help break the cycle of violence for those experiencing maltreatment in their younger years? Or if there are criminal justice or other interventions that you think are promising, we'd love to hear about them. Maybe Grace, you can go first.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of the refugees that I grew up with, I did not grow up in a camp, but I grew up with a couple of other Rwandan and Burundian refugees. And unfortunately, I did see this cycle. You start off being mistreated, and then you end up going into, violence yourself. And I think the biggest thing that I took away from that is that while individual change is possible, the start has to be from a big level, a governmental level, an organizational level. So more programs that take young children away from the streets into busy work. I know there's a couple of organizations that do things like that. I think even Sonke probably does, or supports organizations like that, where children can spend their days as opposed to spending their days running around in the streets and stuff like that. But I'll give space to other panelists to speak.
Thank you, Grace. Maybe to pick on your tone, I think something that we have seen in our interventions is that we lack positive role models in our societies. So, I mean, as a young person, if I grow up seeing my father beating up my mother, so as a young man, if I, get into the dating stage, for me, that's a norm. So for me, it becomes normal for me to beat up my girlfriend. So what we usually try and do, is to have sessions with young people and talk about this, these situations around violence, like, just going through your background, trying to identify, how are you really linked to violence? And in most cases, we find that young people really don't have positive role models in their lives. So what we do, we try and identify positive role models in our communities. We live in a majorly fatherless society where young men don't know their fathers. So what we do, we've had several programs like the Baba Buya, translated as comeback father, something like that, where we adopt a positive man in our community who becomes a role model, where young men are able to go and seek guidance from him. We also look at, faith leaders. I know there are some good faith leaders out there, and, look at how these good positive role models can try and groom these young men into becoming better men. So for me, that's one way that I think we have tried to, change how young men, especially young men who have been exposed to violence, can somehow change their views. So we have several programs that are there, but I think for now I'll speak about the good role model fatherhood programs that we have.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point, Mpho, and some other questions in the chat have touched on this as well, is how do we break down the silos between violence prevention for children and violence prevention for women who are adults? And I think when that comes to donors and governments and organizations, like this need to develop a life cycle approach to violence and wellness rather than focusing on age groups, I think that is a really important topic for us at the Commission, but also is really needed in the research and advocacy spaces as well. I don't know if others have any last minute thoughts to add to that.
Can I come in quickly on
Please,
this?
yes.
So I completely agree, and thank you to participants who raised these questions. I think they're so important. I think some of it honestly does go back to us as researchers unlearning and relearning, because there now is increasing evidence on how systems, on how structures, on how lack of financing negatively affects violence outcomes, and actually how policy changes can affect violence. I think a lot of the evidence base is still skewed towards what can be changed at the individual level, but I think that's slowly changing. And so I think there's a question to answer this question here, which is what kinds of research are we willing to fund and to try to pursue to strengthen the evidence base around how structures and systems affect violence. And I think the life course is a really good framework to hang this on, because exposures that our grandparents experienced, we are living, and we will pass on our exposures to future generations. Thanks.
Great. So I want to thank you all again so much for your insightful questions, and to the panelists for your insights. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for all of you. I am going to try the video from Dr. Clinton one more time using a different sound sharing approach. So if it works, great. If not, then we will shoot directly to Dr. Flavia Bustreo, who provides some closing remarks as co-chair of the Lancet Commission.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Clinton, and I just want to thank you all for being here today to discuss this really important topic. Violence against young people is persistent, pernicious, and widespread, as more than a third of women and girls, over 1 billion people, experience intimate partner violence or non-partner physical or sexual violence in their lifetimes. 42% of all homicides, some 200,000 homicides, take the lives of people under 29 years of age. And 1 in 8 young people worldwide has reported sexual abuse, and we know that that is likely an undercount. The risk of gender-based violence is higher for people, young people especially, living in poverty and vulnerable situations, and those in forced migration or humanitarian emergencies. Fundamentally, gender-based violence and maltreatment are human rights violations. They're violations to the human rights of equality and non-discrimination, to the health and the security of the person, to privacy, to freedom from torture and cruelty, and are always, always wrong. Survivors live with long-term health effects, and whole societies and economies are affected with the increased demand that comes from gender-based violence on overstretched health systems, and all of that adds to the perpetuation of poverty and gender inequality. We know that crises are a catalyst for increased gender-based violence, and certainly we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic that this has happened again. Gender-based violence rates are rising all over the world, including here in the United States, my home country, but unfortunately, in every country where we have good, reliable data, we know that this is happening. In addressing gender-based violence, it's really important that we hear from young people. It's really important that we hear from young people as we think about not only preventing gender-based violence, but also in kind of the services and the strategies that are needed to help support survivors of gender-based violence. Youth voices are vital, and yet too often are not centered or heard from. And so I just want to thank you all for being here today as we do center young people's voices, as we do hear from, listen to, and hopefully begin to really respond to what young people are saying they need in this moment and in the many moments ahead. Thank you all for being here again for this important conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm glad we got that to work. Thank you, Jessica. Dr. Bustreo, we'd love to hear some closing remarks from you.
Thank you very much, Nick and colleagues. It's fantastic that we could have such a rich and vibrant conversation this afternoon. For Dr. Knoll and myself as co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Maltreatment of Young People, this is exactly what we were hoping that the afternoon exchange would be. It's just the beginning of a conversation, and I really want to thank NCD Child, Mary, and also Grace Gatera. They are our two young commissioners in the commission for beginning to think about this webinar and putting together the ideas. I think we understood very clearly this evening that only when you hear from the people whose life have been touched from violence, then you can begin to identify the right answer, both for prevention and also for response. And in our research, in our attempt to compile a report for the Lancet that will hopefully move the ground and shake and create action to really respond to this pandemic within the pandemic, we really want the voices and the experiences lived by young people to be central on this. And so I thank you very much for the insights in how to conduct participatory research and using participatory methods that are respectful of those voices. And I thank very much people such as Grace that have had the incredible courage to come forward and speak about her own experience. Rest assured that we are really wanting to continue this exploration with you, with our young commissioner, and with also some of the participants to this webinar. Please stay in touch with us. We want to continue this conversation, continue this putting together the evidence and the knowledge of what are the policies that work. And certainly we see that during this time, during the pandemic time, clearly the problem of violence has been exacerbated. So now more than ever, it's time to hear to the voices of the young people and give them the possibility to lead that change that is required. One last thought from me. I really hope, and this is a comment for you, Marie, I really hope one other year we can organize a session like this where the ministers of health hear from young people and from their lived experience. Next week, under the 94 Minister of Health will gather under the World Health Assembly. They will read, maybe their missions will read probably a report 5 years after the World Health Organization launched the first plan of action to address violence against women, against girls, and against children. And they will not be the young voices that they should be hearing from. So hopefully together we can make the case that next time around that will happen, and that will shake and change the perspective of the policymakers. Thank you very much for helping us in this quest, and thank you very much for the contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flavia, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. I just really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here with us and share and learn from these such important topics and insights. I hope everyone has a nice evening, afternoon, and see you next time.